we kick at 9 o'clock Pacific time, noon Eastern time. This is Sports by Brooks on Fancred. And again, we kick it off every weekday, noon Eastern time, 9 Pacific time. I'm Brooks Melchior, and we're going to be here for a while talking football. Coming up, we're going to have Ross Dellinger talking college football, Barrett Sallee, Peter Burns. That's a freaking all-star lineup for college football, really about as good as you're going to get. I'm going to give you new information about the USC coaching sweepstakes. Clay Helton will not be back as coach next season. We've established that on this show. We're going to give you some new names, at least one new name that you're going to want to remember because this person should be considered, and from what I'm being told, is being considered for that USC job if and when it opens up. It's going to open up. Of course, Urban Meyer is the man. He's the guy, but maybe he isn't. We'll talk more about that. We're going to delve into that. Also, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Auburn situation. Of course, I've been attacked all over Twitter by all manner of mainstream sports media. Bob Stoops went after me on the radio in Houston, I believe it was, on 105.3 The Fan. So we're going to get into that, and I'll address what Bob Stoops said about his lack of interaction. We'll call it that. That was in Dallas, 105.3 The Fan in Dallas. Thank you, Cam Smith, our producer in Boston, helping me with that. So I'll talk about that. And Antonio Brown, we may or may not get into that if we have time. I'm thinking maybe later in the show I want to address something that I just tweeted out that it appears from what Robert Klemko is saying of Sports Illustrated, and of course, he just addressed that situation with Antonio Brown in his follow-up article documenting some of the peccadillos. We'll put it diplomatically. Involving Antonio Brown. Robert Klemko on Fox Sports Radio last night said that there is a criminal charge coming down against Antonio Brown. And he said it did not involve sexual assault. It did not involve anything involving debt. It involved something that Klemko called, and I'm quoting, communications. Now, that's why you're tuning into this show, because you don't know about that. You're a Patriots fan, you're an NFL fan, you're a football fan. You didn't know about that. If you're not following my Twitter, follow it if you want to be ahead of things. All right? So it looks like Antonio Brown is going to be facing a criminal charge. This came out last night, and we'll talk to Burt Breer about that. Burt Breer works at Sports Illustrated, oversees the MMQB, and he's going to be with us coming up here shortly. We'll talk about that. We'll touch on that with him. And we'll also talk about the Jalen Ramsey situation, which is, to me, kind of a groundbreaking thing, an unprecedented thing. I'm fascinated to hear what Burt Breer has to say about that. He just wrote a nice article in SI about it for MMQB. Of course, Burt Breer also a stalwart on the Sports Hub 98.5 in Boston, NBC Sports Boston as well. Albert Breer will join us coming up later in the show. So it's Ross Dellinger, Barrett Sallee, who has kind of a tight schedule. We're going to try to get a window with him. And then Peter Burns will have time later on to talk to him, talk about what is a big weekend of college football that actually starts coming up tomorrow with Utah and USC. And I want to get into Utah and USC before our first guest hops on with us, Ross Dellinger. And I want to talk a little bit about the coaching situation in a more detailed, refined way. I mentioned yesterday that Urban Meyer, of course, the leading candidate to take over for Clay Helton. And of course, yesterday on this show, I revealed exclusively that it's a matter of days. It's a matter of weeks, not seasons, when it comes to assessing the future coaching status of Clay Helton at USC. I've been told if USC gets embarrassed by several touchdowns against Utah at the Coliseum tomorrow night on Fox, Clay Helton will be fired. He will be fired, and he will. USC will have an interim coach this Saturday morning, if that is to happen. I've also been told that if USC comes up short against Washington and Utah, and they play extremely poorly, that bye week that comes up after the Washington game, before the Notre Dame game, and Washington is a road game for USC, I've been told to look at the bye week as a time that Helton will be let go. Either way, look, hey, I'm not burying Clay Helton. I'm not burying him. And if they run the table, who's to say he won't be back? And they have enough talent to do it, and they have a good quarterback. This really underlines the problem with Clay Helton. They have enough talent. They have a good quarterback. They actually have a pretty decent offensive scheme. Yet you look at the BYU game, and it's sloppiness, errors, poor judgment, poor coaching that cost USC that game. That's not a game. If you're a good coach, you lose. If you're USC, understand that. USC has infinitely more talent than BYU. You don't lose that game. And that's why Clay Helton is going to be out of a job shortly. Nothing personal. So Urban Meyer is the guy, just so you know, that the old guard, the people who have been hiring coaches since the beginning of time at USC, the people with all the money on the board of trustees, be it stealth or otherwise, they've been hiring coaches. I mean, you go back in time, you may know the name Jerry Buss. Jerry Buss was the owner of the Los Angeles Lakers, and he created the dynasty that is the LA Lakers. Jerry Buss, he has since passed away, and his daughter Jeannie Buss now runs the team. Well, Jerry Buss, believe it or not, was extremely influential in who got hired as head football coach at USC. He was a big donor, obviously a big celebrity, very influential in sports circles, Los Angeles circles, and a USC alum. Jerry Buss wasn't on the board of trustees, but he was an invisible hand, and he played a direct role in who got hired as head coach at USC. Rick Caruso is a guy right now, regardless of what people may tell you. Rick Caruso is the chairman of the board of trustees. All right. He's a billionaire developer here in Los Angeles, Rick Caruso, and he is intimately involved in who is going to be hired by the University of Southern California for their next head coach. And he wants Urban Meyer, as does all of the prominent, well-moneyed alumni at USC. And of course, Urban Meyer is a perfect fit when you talk about amorality, right? USC right now is going through multiple lawsuits in which the school is going to have to dole out on the order of $500 million, right? That's coming down the pike. It's a PR disaster involving USC personnel and lawsuits, class action suits that have been filed against USC professors in the past, malfeasance involving a gynecologist that has essentially brought the university down. And then on top of all of that, we get the college admission scandal. So that's the backdrop of the situation when we're talking about hiring the next coach at USC. And along with Urban Meyer, I've got at least one name that I'm going to run by you. So you're going to be ahead of the game. You're going to know who USC is weighing as a potential candidate, not necessarily pursuing, but weighing, much in the way that I reported Auburn was weighing, at least Jimmy Rain, who makes the decision there, who's going to be the next head coach, the number one guy, most powerful guy at Auburn. He's weighing Bob Stoops. I want to clarify all that as we go along here on Sports by Brooks on Fancred. But first, I want to bring on one of our friends, Ross Dellinger of Sports Illustrated, one of the preeminent college football reporters, writers, and you want to follow him on Twitter. Absolute amazing follow. That one of my favorite follows. He's a guy, I always say this, Ross, I hate you because you're so much better at Twitter than I am. So
I don't know about that.
Yeah, I'm just, no, you are. Trust me on that. But I appreciate you taking the time, man, on a big weekend of college football coming up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is a big one. We had kind of a not as big one last week. In fact, I stayed home, didn't even go to a game. But this week, yeah, this week's was pretty good.
So what are you looking at specifically this weekend?
Well, I'll be heading to Athens for Georgia Notre Dame, which might be a blowout, but I'm going to go anyway and see the Bulldogs and see the Irish play. I think some other things. Auburn and Texas A&M is intriguing. Um, that's Auburn has not looked to me like necessarily like a top 10 team. In fact, honestly, Oregon should have probably beat them. But give credit to Auburn and Bo Nix and for hanging around and then storming back like they did. So can they win? On the road, hostile environment. Big division game against one of the better coaches, obviously in the nation in Jimbo. So that's one that is pretty significant that I'm looking forward to. Obviously, a Friday night, out there in LA, USC and Utah play a pretty big game. That's obviously a huge game for you were just talking about it. I know for Clay and kind of his tenure there.
Visiting with Ross Dellinger of Sports Illustrated. When you look at the Georgia Notre Dame game, I brought this up in a poll earlier today. And so if Notre Dame loses this game, I don't think it eliminates them in the college football playoff, at least in terms of consideration. But what about Georgia? If Georgia loses this game somehow to Notre Dame, could that spell the end of the possibilities of the college football playoff this year for the Bulldogs?
Well, I think that if Georgia loses, it just they have very small margin of error if they lose. I mean, pretty much zero margin of error because they'd have to run the table. They'd have to probably beat Alabama in the SEC championship game and all that. If they win the game, they're given a little more margin of error. I even think they could probably lose to Alabama in the championship game, maybe, and get in. I mean, we saw some of that last year. They didn't get in, but I think it's possible. So if they lose this one, they basically, they have to run the table. And obviously, same for Notre Dame. If they lose this one, Notre Dame would definitely have to run the table because of a one-loss team from independent, when no conference. They don't have that championship game to kind of lean on like Georgia would. So they don't have that extra win. So it's almost in a way it's almost bigger for Notre Dame, I guess, because Georgia could probably get there even with a loss to Notre Dame because they'd have to beat Alabama in the championship game, but they would have that and Notre Dame wouldn't.
What about A&M and Auburn when you look at the college football playoff? And I'm not ruling out either team right now, but is that essentially an elimination game for those two teams?
Yeah, certainly for A&M, they already have a loss to Clemson. I mean, they can't have two losses, and it would be hard for me to see either one of them. I think making it to the playoff, but obviously, the loser of it is for all intents and purposes out.
Well, the one thing about that game, though, when you look at those two teams, arguably the toughest schedules in the country for each of those two teams at the very top of the list. So,
yeah,
I mean,
absolutely. Anybody in the SEC West, I mean, it's brutal. And then you throw in Auburn's non-conference, like we talked about Oregon, and then in A&M's non-conference at Clemson. So it's brutal. Auburn always has Georgia, obviously. Auburn's schedule every year is incredible, and this year, having to play Oregon really just intensifies that. I think that you look at A&M's schedule again with the Clemson on there, just all the SEC West teams. It's tough. For either one of those teams to go 10-2 even would be pretty dang good, I think.
So we're visiting with Ross Dellinger of Sports Illustrated. Another big game, at least for my money, a game that I'm going to be really tracking closely is the Michigan-Wisconsin game. This is one of those games where you saw Michigan struggle against Army, so you've got that question mark in your mind. Jim Harbaugh sets the whole thing up to make it that much more interesting, right? And then you got Wisconsin. Wisconsin, it's a death, taxes, and Wisconsin with a ridiculous non-conference schedule every year. You can count on it. You can set your watch to Wisconsin playing no one. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if Michigan broke out in this game and scored a nice victory. But from my perspective, at least to start things off, and I want your general assessment of the game, but I want to ask you a question first off, specifically. What do you think about Shea Patterson?
Shea would spend some time in Louisiana when I was down there, and he was heavily recruited by LSU when I covered them. And they liked him. Franks committed at the time, and so they didn't really go after Shea really hard. But Shea's got a lot of hype around him. It's hard to live up to a certain amount, and I think he has got that. He's dealing with that situation where
is it justified? As I look at this guy, has that hype ever been justified? Is there something behind that hype, maybe dating back to high school? I mean, because I watched the guy, Ross, and I'm like, okay, I'm waiting for the payoff. When's something going to happen here?
Yeah. It probably does. Yeah, it dates back to high school. He went to IMG Academy.
There you go.
Academy and all that. Everybody that goes there has all kind of hype and attention. Also, I think Shea is better in a certain kind of offense, and I actually think we saw him better in Ole Miss's spread offense. Now, I know Michigan was kind of trying to do that this year, but we haven't really seen much of it. We haven't seen much of it be successful, like, for instance, like at LSU or some other places that have changed. We've seen it be real successful. But Shea is certainly better in the shotgun, throwing it around, kind of zone read type offense. And he was really good at Ole Miss as a freshman. I mean, we saw him come in. He came in against LSU, I believe. And, and the next year he was hurt against LSU. But, we saw him pretty good there. I just, I think it's about fit. It was a weird thing when he left Ole Miss. I remember thinking he's going to Harbaugh's offense, I mean, that's one of the.
What is Harbaugh's offense? I don't even know what it is.
Well, I mean, I think it in a lot of ways it was like what Les Miles for a long time ran at LSU.
Right.
And it's the pro style kind of traditional offense.
It's kind of like a mystery meat offense.
They say they said they were going to change, and we've seen a little bit of it, but they kind of resorted back to some of the old school ways against Army, and they really struggled there. So, it would be obviously significant win for them at Wisconsin, and something they certainly need. It is hard to tell how good Wisconsin is because of who they play. They haven't allowed a point all season, but you look at what offenses they were against, and so it's kind of tough. But this will be a real good gauge for both teams.
Yeah, and I think when you look at the Heisman field this year, I can't remember. Maybe there has been recently, but I can't remember a better Heisman field, at least coming out of the first few games. Some unbelievable stars. And we haven't had a lot of that in college football, where you had this plethora of potential stars. We'll see how it all plays out, all the way down to a guy like Zach Wilson at BYU, who's an intriguing guy who, if they continue to play well, who knows? But it's such a stacked field. And I'm leading up to ask you about Jonathan Taylor at Wisconsin. How legit is this guy? Because good Lord, Wisconsin Twitter, Wisconsin media, you would think this guy is the next a different type of running back, but he's another Ron Dane. I mean, what's your assessment of that guy?
It's funny because they struggled so much last year. I didn't watch them play very much, and obviously they hadn't played anybody this year, as we mentioned. So I haven't watched him a ton.
Right.
But you see the stats, and you're like,
right.
What is going on here? It's unbelievable. I mean, some of the numbers that he's put up are just incredible. So I'm looking forward to watching him more for sure. You hear scouts and things talk about him, obviously, as somebody that they want on the next level and they're excited about. So he must have. I mean, to put up those numbers, it's pretty incredible. So I'm looking forward to watching him because Michigan's defense is always pretty solid and strong again this year. It looks like. So I'm looking forward to kind of watching him and watching him run because Wisconsin has forever had, as you mentioned, had those running backs that come through that have been incredible. It's kind of been a RBU place, and he's just the next in line, I guess.
Talking to Ross Dellinger of Sports Illustrated on Sports by Brooks on Fancred. And good Lord, how is Ohio State still playing cream puffs this late in schedule? But they're taking on Miami of Ohio. And I don't know if you saw the comment that the coach of Miami of Ohio had about the talent differential. Yeah. Did you see that on Twitter?
I did.
where the Miami of Ohio coach, he was asked about the talent between the two teams, and he said, it's a little bit like recess, but one of the teams gets the first 85 picks on, when you're choosing up sides at recess. And I think that that's certainly an apt description of the situation. So we're not going to find out anything about Ohio State coming up. But, what are the odds? Until we get into the schedule, and it's not going to get all that much better. They're going to play Nebraska on the road. They're going to play Michigan State at home. The Big Ten is what it is. But what's your assessment? What's your feel for Ryan Day in the early going?
Yeah, it's kind of like Wisconsin.
Right.
How much do we know really about them? I remember I was researching something and about their schedule, and I think it's week 7. They don't play a team that finished inside the 2018 top 25 until week 7. I want to say Northwestern. So they go 6-7 weeks.
Right.
For 6-7 weeks, we're playing teams
and it's Northwestern. And it's Northwestern,
yeah.
Even though, it is what it is.
Northwestern, right. Who lost at Stanford.
Right.
We now know Stanford is really not the team and not the defense that they've been in the past. So
and was blown out by USC and UCF, right?
Right. Just got rolled. So by a true freshman quarterback on both of those. So, it's hard to say how good Ohio State is. I'll be honest, I haven't been super impressed offensively. Fields every now and then, and I've watched them a good bit because they play at noon a lot. And he seems to panic in the pocket a little bit and then kind of just pull it down and run. So when he gets a good defense, which again probably won't happen for another month, but I'd really like to see kind of how he handles that, because Ohio State's defense has clearly been pretty solid. Special teams is incredible. But offensively, with the new quarterback and all, I've got some questions that I'm sure will not be answered for another month or so.
Of course, we got USC coming up on Friday against Utah. What's your thought on that game?
Well, that was huge for Clay Helton. He really can't afford to necessarily lose that one right now. You looked at USC's first 6 games, and they're brutal. I remember thinking in the start of the season they could go 2-4, and they lose against Utah, and you're head down that potential 2-4 path where I just can't imagine him sticking around if that's the start they're on. So
what I'm hearing is he could be fired if they get destroyed by Utah. He could be fired after the game, and if they lose both to Utah and Washington and they're embarrassed, to look for that bye week. I've been told sources and things that the bye week is probably where he would be jettisoned. That's a distinct possibility.
Yeah, and that's usually when you usually see, when you see a mid-coaching firing, a lot of times you do see it happen on the bye weeks. Everybody can kind of regroup. So that would make a lot of sense. And obviously with Lynn gone, doesn't help Clay's future. And Utah, Utah's got a chance on their side to kind of prove, hey, we're a good team and we're a top 10 kind of team. They're the last resort for the Pac-12, really. You see Washington get beat at home by Cal. Oregon blew it on the road against Auburn. Utah is the last standing man in the Pac-12 to potentially represent them in the CFP.
I want to ask you one more thing before we let you go. I want to ask you about Tennessee, because this is something that I tweeted about yesterday, and I've thought about. A lot of people have talked about the Jeremy Pruitt coaching situation. And to me, it's deeper than it looks. It's easy to say, well, let's say they go 3-8 or they have a really bad season. We're going to cut bait. But I don't think it's that simple with Tennessee in particular, because you've got those recruiting headwinds. Number one, when you've got Saban, you've got Kirby, you've got Dabo. It hasn't always been that way. And Tennessee has been able to recruit out of state. They have to recruit out of state. It's really remarkable they've had as good a program as they have, because they don't have that in-state talent. They have some, but certainly not along the lines of the states south of Tennessee. So when you look at the recruiting headwinds, you look at the pitiful roster right now, which the talent's just not there. All of those things put together, and then an unstable athletic department with Phil Fulmer. Who knows if he's coming or going? When it comes to a top coaching candidate, from people that I've talked to around college football, people who represent some of those coaching candidates, what I'm hearing, Ross, is that the attractiveness of that job has dropped dramatically, to the point where Tennessee really isn't on the radar of some of the top coaching candidates. That's what I'm hearing that are out there. Some of the high profile assistant coaches, guys that could, or head coaches at programs at lower levels of the FBS. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on the possibility that maybe you just ride or die with Jeremy Pruitt? Is that a possibility? Might that be a better idea for Tennessee, just to kind of see what happens?
Well, I mean, I always look to the AD, the guy who hired him still in place, and that always helps.
Right.
This situation is different because the guy who hired him is the former legendary coach, and you got to wonder. He's about the same age as Mac Brown. I think they're about the same.
Interesting.
Does he want to step back in and coach football? I know he got in trouble maybe during camp because he was like coaching at camp. Philip Fulmer was, and he wasn't allowed to do that through NCAA rules, or do a secondary report. So it makes me wonder if he wants to get back into it. But what you're saying is true. Tennessee's like Nebraska. They're these historic programs that have won for years and years and have these high expectations and these huge fan bases, but they really don't have a good recruiting ground, and that really hurts them. It's going to hurt them in the future, I think. So they have to go, like you said, they have to go out of state. They have to recruit nationally.
Ross, I really appreciate the time. Look forward to doing it again, man. Thanks for dropping in.
Yeah, man. No problem.
That's Ross Dellinger of Sports Illustrated. And speaking of Sports Illustrated, we're going to go back out and talk to another gentleman with Sports Illustrated. He oversees the MMQB, the NFL. He's a stalwart in the NFL media. Also does some work in Boston for 98.5, the Sports Hub, NBC Sports Boston. Bert Breer is going to be joining us here shortly. How you doing, Bert?
Hey, Brooks. What's going on?
I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed your article today talking about what could be, an unprecedented sort of major story that's starting to wash over the NFL with the Jalen Ramsey episode. Tell us a little bit about that article and that development.
Yeah, I think it's the sort of change in the NFL now in the way that, big name veteran players are handled. And I think we've seen guys move that you wouldn't have seen moved 5-10 years ago. And so I went back and I looked at, and over the first 8 years of this decade, there are only 8 guys, 8 veteran players who were moved for first-round picks. And then, over the last 16 months, we've had 7 players that were moved for first-round picks, and Jalen Ramsey would be an 8th. And so there are a lot of different factors, but I think there's been this perception forever that you don't have big blockbuster trades in the NFL. And for a long time, that was true. They were very, very rare for a long period of time. But over the last 16 months, we've seen that change in a big way. And, it's just sort of crystallized with me with Jalen Ramsey becoming available a couple days ago. And, I started to ask around a little bit, and, it's absolutely not by accident that this is happening. And, the people that I talk to at least don't think that it's going to come to an end anytime soon.
So do you think that this could be something that rises to the level of the sort of NBA player movement, that sort of thing that we've seen in the past in the NBA? Are we headed towards that?
Yeah, I mean, and there are a lot of different reasons why, but I think that that's definitely possible. I mean, I think it starts with a younger group of general managers who are a little bit more aggressive in looking at players and looking at different ways to acquire players. I think another part of it is, if you figure out, we're not going to be able to re-sign a guy, teams are going to be more aggressive about putting those guys in the market. And then I think analytics come into play too. And that's something that came up with a bunch of different guys that I talked to over the last couple of days where, they're learning how to value all of their assets a little bit better. And so they're valuing the draft picks correctly now and understanding that, a low first round pick might not have the value that some people think it does. And they're valuing cap space. And, it comes down to a bunch of different ways that you can build a team and a bunch of different ways you can look at all the different pieces of building a team. But, I think that there's just more aggression. There's going to be more aggression in general as far as moving veteran players, both from the teams that are moving them and the teams that are looking to acquire them because of a number of different factors and, a number of different ways of looking at team building.
Talking to Bert Breer of MMQB over at Sports Illustrated. I'm really interested, though, in another thing that we haven't brought up yet, and that has been cited for the lack of player movement over the years in the NFL, and that's the collective bargaining agreement. Yeah. How does that interface with this situation?
Brooks, I would tell you, if you want to go back to the advent of the CBA, it's one of the reasons why we saw less holdouts for 5, 6, 7 years. If you remember, before the last CBA was done, the Darrelle Revis situation was at the top of the news, and he held out for the entire summer of 2010. And you'd had a bunch of situations like that. I believe Chris Johnson was a year or two before that. And so, the owners look to put different mechanisms in the CBA to prevent players from holding out that way, especially players earlier in their careers. And so there are safeguards in there. The penalties financially are much harsher than they were in the past when guys hold out. On top of that, players can't do long-term deals. Guys that are drafted at least can't do long-term deals until they've got 3 years of service under their belts. And so for a long time, for 5, 6, 7 years, that prevented guys from holding out. It prevented some player movement. And then you had guys like Khalil Mack and Aaron Donald saying, you know what, find me. I do whatever you want to me. I'm holding out. I'm staying away. And I think that really sort of, gave players a better understanding that they did have leverage. Even
visiting with Burt Breer of MMQB as he joins us. And we'll be getting back to him momentarily. I think we've lost him, Cam, on the guest line. So we'll work on that. We've been talking to Burt about player movement, Jalen Ramsey, that situation, sort of an unprecedented thing in the fluidity of it, how the skids have seemingly been greased to allow for Jalen Ramsey to be traded in the middle of the season. A hot commodity, to say the least. A great cornerback. Guys like that do not become available. And I think it may speak to the guy running that franchise, Tom Coughlin, his personality. It might not be the most advisable thing to do if you're the Jags, but then again, it may be an untenable situation, especially after the physical confrontation between Doug Marrone, the coach of the Jaguars, off the field during a game, and Jalen Ramsey last week. Now, they've smoothed things over on a public basis, but privately, obviously, there's still something there because Jalen Ramsey seems dead set. Let's bring dead set in leaving Jacksonville. Let's bring Burt back up if we can. Mm-hmm. So we were talking. Yeah, that's okay. We were talking about the CBA and how that might play into the future of player movement in the NFL.
Yeah, and I think you guys got the part about how hard it was for players to hold out in the past, and Khalil Mack and Aaron Donald, that the two of those guys holding out and basically saying the hell with it. Like I don't care if you find me, I'm going to make what I'm worth. I think it really started like when those guys wind up winning in their situations. I think it sort of allowed some other players to look at it and say, even though there are these rules in place to prevent me from trying to maximize my bargaining power, I still have leverage here, and I still have an impact on the team if I'm staying away. And so I think it's emboldened some other guys to look at it and say to themselves, I can force a team's hand if I make things uncomfortable on them. And I think the NBA, had an effect on that too. And so I think Donald and Mack were sort of the front end of that. And then you saw Antonio Brown basically kick and scream and shove his way out of Pittsburgh in January. And I think that took it to another level. And now, you've got guys who are looking at their own situations and saying either A, I want to be somewhere else, or B, if you're not going to pay me, I want to find somebody, who will. And, guys look at that and say, okay, like, what can I do to try to get myself in a better situation? And they're much more willing than they were maybe even 3 or 4 years ago to force a team's hand.
You mentioned Antonio Brown, and of course, Robert Klemko did a great piece, investigative piece for Sports Illustrated recently, and he was on Fox Sports Radio last night, Robert Klemko, saying that there could be now a criminal charge coming down the pike potentially against Antonio Brown. Have you heard anything about the latest on that front? Yeah,
and I wouldn't be surprised if there are more accusations that bubble to the surface here. And you know how this works, Brooks, right? Like, so, one case winds up coming to light, and that happened with a lawsuit last week. And then another case comes to light, and then all of a sudden you might have some other people who were involved with Antonio Brown who are emboldened to come forward. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there are cases out there that the public hasn't heard about that come to light, in the coming weeks. I don't think this thing is over. And the real question, I think, from a football standpoint, because we are talking about a football player here, is, when the heat gets to the level where, the commissioner is uncomfortable enough to put him on the exempt list. I think one thing that people need to remember here, it's not all about criminal charges. That exempt list can be enforced at the commissioner's discretion. And I think, though, the one thing you really need to look at, it's the credibility of the accusation. It's not the nature of the charge. It's the credibility of the accusation. And Kareem Hunt's a perfect example of it. It was over a year ago that the accusation against him came to light. Most people didn't take it seriously. It didn't get to the level where he was charged criminally, but it did become public. And 8-9 months later, video comes to light, and then all of a sudden the accusation has credibility because we could all see it in black and white, and the commissioner put him on the exempt list. And so if it gets to a level where it's embarrassing for the league and where the league's going to feel uncomfortable putting him on a field on Sunday, I think that's where they decide to put him on the exempt list. It hasn't got there yet, but I would not rule out that happening, especially after they spent 10 hours with his accuser on Monday.
Now, I'm not putting words in your mouth, but in this discussion, you've only mentioned the league. You've only mentioned the commissioner.
Yeah.
But what about the Patriots? Are you essentially saying, are you implying that the Patriots aren't going to do anything no matter what?
I would tell you this. I think if things remain the same, they won't. I think they'll go forward with him.
Even if there's a criminal charge?
If there's a criminal charge, I do think things change.
Really? So how will they change?
Because a lot of things have sort of gotten out there at this point. And look, I think for the Kraft family, one thing you have to remember is that this brings to light what happened in January in Florida. And This brings that back into the discussion. And, the amazing thing about it, Brooks, he was up there. Robert Kraft was up there on the podium on that Sunday night as the banner dropped, right? No one was talking about it. And I don't think any of us imagined in March or April that he was even going to be there. And he sort of turned the page on all of this somehow. It's amazing that happened, that we weren't talking about it as he was up there. And so in a way, it feels like he was sort of out of the woods on that. And now for him personally and for his family, this brings that back into the public discussion. And so I think that there is some level of embarrassment with the way that the last 2 weeks have gone for the Crafts. And I think that my sense would be that they're being a little careful about overreacting to just a civil charge at this point. But if the evidence starts to mount and it becomes one thing after another, I wouldn't be totally shocked if Robert Kraft says to Bill Belichick, we got to get rid of this guy. I don't think it'll be Belichick that does it. I think it would have to be Kraft, but I would not rule out the idea that Kraft could do that at some point.
I think the X factor here is if this bleeds over to CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and I'm actually really, really surprised that an outlet like Fox News hasn't grasped onto this yet and really started to flail away at it. But I think that if that starts to happen, it becomes this tsunami.
That's a great point. Yeah, that's a great point because, and it's interesting because I think one of the things that was particularly embarrassing about this for Kraft to begin with was who was it that brought the lawsuit to light? It was the New York Times. And I think it really added weight to the story. If this had just been TMZ, it probably would have been perceived a little bit differently. And I think that the public relations hit would have been a little different for the Kraft family. But I think you hit the nail on the head. And you know how all these owners operate. They don't have ESPN on in their office. They have MSNBC, CNN, Fox News. They have that on in their office, and they've got the New York Times and the Washington Post on their desk. And so those are the outlets that the people that they
that connects to Trump,
right? And those are the outlets of the people that they run with, right? That's what they read. That's what they watch. And so I'm with you. I think if it gets into that realm, and now all of a sudden CNN's covering it on a day-to-day basis, Fox News is covering it on a day-to-day basis, then it takes on a different context for Kraft.
One last question.
Yep.
Why is it that Eric Reed is kneeling, outspoken, articulate in that, but and he has a job. Kenny Stills has a job. Similar situation. We had this sort of conflict with Stephen Ross, Brian Flores, the Jay-Z situation, and Kenny Stills is not coincidentally jettisoned, and Colin Kaepernick doesn't have a job. I mean, this makes no sense.
Yeah, well, here's what I would tell you, Brooks. I think as much as anything, this is about what you're willing to take on against the talent, right? Like, and so Eric Reid's a starting safety, and the Panthers aren't taking on a whole lot. Like it's once every couple of weeks something comes up, but he's a starting safety. And you bring up Kenny Stills. Kenny Stills is somebody who's producing on the field,
right?
For better or worse,
he's an elite level player,
right? And here for better or worse, and this is something I think that like people. And I want to put this as sensitively as I possibly can. Coaches want their backup quarterbacks to blend in with the furniture. That's just that's the way it's always been. That's why Josh McCown, for example, has gotten job after job after job. He's helpful to the other guys in the room. He's part of the team. He's not disruptive. That's what coaches want in their backup quarterbacks. And quite honestly, and I'm not comparing the two. It's not apples to apples, but that's why Tim Tebow didn't have a second life in the NFL as a backup. It's a huge reason why.
Interesting.
Because teams didn't want to take on everything that came with Tim Tebow just for a backup quarterback. If he's your starter, you're willing to put up with almost anything. If it's a top 5 guy in your roster, you're willing to put up with almost anything. When it's
Antonio Brown.
When it's the 30th or 40th guy in the roster, yeah. I mean, like when it's the 30th or 40th guy in the roster, it's like I'm not dealing with that. And so that's a huge part of it in all of these cases. And I just think that there's a sliding scale there that's a huge part of the equation for every single team in the NFL, where you're looking at it and you're saying to yourself, if I'm going to put up with all of that, I need big time production on the field. And I'm not saying like I think Colin's done a lot of admirable things, but Colin would bring a lot into the locker room for whoever is signing him in a lot of different ways. And I think that there are just a lot of coaches out there and a lot of GMs out there that look at it and say, for some depth at quarterback, to me, maybe that's just not worth it.
And, I think a big part of the story we don't talk about is it's not just Colin, it's who's with Colin, who's around Colin. I think that's probably the bigger issue here. But
and I think for some owners too, I mean, I think one thing that's sort of flown a little under the radar was what happened with the Ravens. And I don't know how well you remember this, Brooks, but I believe it was his girlfriend tweeted out a picture that basically depicted, it was a meme, basically depicted Steve Bisciotti as a slave owner.
Remember it well.
And so if you think about that, like there are going to be some teams that won't even bring him in because they're going to say, why am I going to, maybe I'd want to bring the guy in for a workout, but why would I risk something like that happening? Better off somebody else do it. And again, I think a lot of the coaches would probably look at Colin Kaepernick versus and Austin Davis was a name that came up a couple months ago. I think when he worked out somewhere, it's like most coaches are going to look at that and say, for all that stuff that's going on, just give me Austin Davis and I'll move on with my day. For right or wrong, I'm not saying that's right, but that's I think that's part of the equation.
I know you're real busy today, Bert. Thanks a lot for squeezing us in, man. It's been great. Hopefully we can do this again.
Anytime, Brooks.
Thanks. That's Bert Breer. You can follow him on Albert Breer at Twitter at Albert Breer, ALBERT BREER. And of course, he is the overseer of sports on the MMQB section of Sports Illustrated, which is really the NFL part of Sports Illustrated, highly acclaimed part of Sports Illustrated, and a must follow. MMQB. Albert also appears on the Sports Hub 98.5 in Boston, NBC Sports Boston as well, formerly of the NFL Network. So we got some NFL there for you. Antonio Brown, Colin Kaepernick, a lot to that Colin Kaepernick story that people, unless we talk about it here, and perhaps when we talk to guys like Bert, who is plugged in, you're not going to hear it anywhere else as to why Colin Kaepernick is not playing. It isn't necessarily just about him. I think if it was just about him, he didn't bring along the girlfriend or the entourage or, the influence that they may have on social media, because we're in this era now where a singular person can reach out to everybody and connect to the whole world in 5 seconds. Colin Kaepernick's situation hangs by a thread because of that. It's different with Eric Reid of the Carolina Panthers, who's kneeling right now. You're probably not even aware of that. Half of you out there aren't. He's kneeling. He's articulate. He's articulating his views. He's very assertive, proactive on Twitter. Eric Reid, Kenny Stills, not that different. Not necessarily on Twitter, but in his public proclamations. So we're going to bring up Barrett Salee now of CBS Sports HQ, and we're going to talk some more college football. One of my favorite guys in the media in general and on Twitter. And Barrett, I appreciate the time. Thanks for squeezing us into this tiny window.
My pleasure, Brooks. Yeah, it's a busy time of year.
It's like an airlock. We're pushing you in and out. So first off, you had some interesting tweets about Bob Stoops, Auburn, but you didn't mention me. Tell me a little bit about, and we're mixing it up a little bit on Twitter. That's what I love about this, about college football. That's what makes it great. And but tell me a little bit about what you understand about the Bob Stoops situation in general.
Well, I mean, honestly, it was a talking point about a year or two ago, really before the 2017 run began, which really was in November. I mean, Gus Malzahn was on the hot seat going into November 2017. He beat Texas A&M, beat Georgia, beat Alabama. All that story sort of told itself. And that was 4 months after Bob Stoops had retired. So, I think, that was hot then. I don't think that really there's been any juice on either side, because from Stoops' perspective, everybody I've talked to, he's content. I mean, he doesn't have to go through the grind. He doesn't want to go through the grind. There's no reason to go through the grind.
You're saying your grind, you mean recruiting, basically.
Well, just in general. I mean,
because he's coaching. He's coaching. The XFL.
Well, the XFL. I mean,
wait a minute.
That's a little different.
But I totally get what you're saying about the grind and what that represents in a big program. Nobody knows better than he does. What about Oklahoma, though? What about his departure? What do you understand about the nature of that? Was he forced out? Was he burned out? Why did that happen?
I wouldn't say burnout. I just think he kind of looked at himself in the mirror and said, hey, you know what? I missed a lot of family stuff. Like, and a lot of coaches go through that, right? Like, you go through your entire life and you're like, holy crap. Like I missed my kids growing up. And then Nick Saban, has even said that at Alabama, where he's like, look, he's not saying when he's going to retire, but he's like, wow, I kind of enjoy the fact that I can go see some grandkids now. That's a lot of coaches it's almost like a coaching midlife crisis, right? Like you kind of get to the middle of your career, you look around and go, wow, I missed a lot of stuff. And I think that's where Bob Stoops was. They knew Lincoln Riley was going to be the coach there anyway. So if he already had that feeling, go ahead and hang it up and move on from there. And that's kind of been, I think, his where he's been really since then. He's living a good life. Why change?
So are you saying that we should not expect Bob Stoops to be coaching, let's say, in the next couple of years in major college football?
Yes, I would be floored if he's ever coaching in college football again.
Really? That's interesting.
Now, the XFL is different, obviously. The XFL is almost like a part-time job at this point.
Well, here's what I will say specifically about the Auburn thing and the Stoops thing. My reporting was Jimmy Rain is fanning out, and he's essentially what my report was. He's targeting Bob Stoops as the top possible replacement if Gus loses to Alabama. Alabama's kind of the benchmark for Auburn. That isn't to say, I'm not saying if Auburn runs the table and loses to Alabama that Malzahn, that's common sense. He's probably going to be back, right?
Sure.
But what I'm saying is what Jimmy Rain's doing, and he's not just doing it with Bob Stoops. I've got sources where he's looking at other people, other top coaching candidates, potentially top assistant coaches. So that's what my understanding was, and that's what I was trying to communicate, with my tweet and my report. But I think people conflated it to mean that there's some sort of nefarious connection going on, and the Stoops is prospecting for that job or any job, and he's not. And I never said he was, and I'm not so sure that. I don't think it would be a fit, because I think the fact that Jimmy Rain is there doing what he's doing is not the kind of place that Bob Stoops would want to be dealing with that.
Well, a couple things on that. I'm pretty plugged in with everything Auburn. I went there. My stepdad played there. My dad went there. I grew up going to games there. I worked in the athletic department. I typically cover SEC. So I've been around that program my entire life.
Boom.
I've seen as much dysfunction as you can possibly see. I've also seen the good, right? I've seen an Auburn program over the last 10 years that I think has sort of moved out of little brother status and is now little cousin with Alabama, because Auburn knows, think about it though. Auburn knows that they can win their way. They can do it by their own accord while Alabama's winning at an elite level. Like you're not little brother at that point. You could be cousin,
and with
but you're
Gus.
not little brother, and with Gus, right? And with Gene Chiswick, with Gus,
of all
people.
Right.
But yeah, right. Although I love Gene. Gene's a super nice guy. But no, I mean, I think the idea that Alabama's, the anchor weighing Auburn down, or always the shadow over Auburn, that's not the case.
Well, here's what, let me push back on this, because I have specific sourcing. The reason I mentioned, I didn't just pull that out of a hat. Jimmy Rain personally, from my sourcing, has indicated that to my sources, that Alabama is a major factor in Gus Malzahn's future. I'm not disputing what you're saying. I'm just saying, as that individual, that's the case with him.
Well, a couple things on that though. That's for older people, whether it be board of trustees members or not. Like, that's for Auburn, that's the case. Younger people, not the case at all. People that are, middle aged, like I am, I'm 39. We kind of know both sides, right? Like we've sort of seen the evolution of it. I will say that with the folks that I've talked to have been 100% behind Gus Malzahn. Now, obviously they are, it would be stupid not to have contingency plans, right? Like you can't go into, obviously it's a critical year, so,
right.
And every year is critical at Auburn. When you have that talent, you need to know, that you're going to be successful. And if you're not, you need to have a contingency plan. I will say this though, the idea that Auburn is run by Jimmy Rain, or that one booster has that kind of power at Auburn, whether it's him or somebody else, that's not really how it works anymore down there. I obviously you're going to have power brokers. Some have more power than others. That's true of every school. And Auburn certainly has been in a situation in the past where they did have somebody like that in Bobby Louder. It's not really run like that anymore. They're obvious, like I said, there are powerful people. There are people with less power. There are influential people, whatever. But the idea that he would have, the ultimate say, that's completely inaccurate. That's not how it's going to work anymore. And so, yeah, I mean, Jimmy would have his guys. Certainly he would. But I think everybody right now, that including Jimmy, they're all coalescing around Gus, and really have been ever since the end of last season, because they saw how dysfunctional it was. They saw how, say the landscape had shifted towards, coaches making a ton of money. They had to pay him 2 years ago. They understand it would cost a lot now. And they figured, it's not worth it to, to try to create dysfunction when the results are going to speak for themselves. And if the results say pay the buyout, then the buyout gets paid. Just plain and simple.
Visiting with Barrett Sallee of CBS Sports HQ, and I know you have a real tight window. We're going to let you go here in a second. But Jeremy Pruitt, Tennessee, to me, is a fascinating story. It's a story that's gotten some play, but I don't think enough, because there's a certain dilemma there I don't think people are accounting for. And some of the people that I've talked to around college football who are connected to coaching candidates, they've indicated to me, Barrett, that job in terms of attractiveness has dropped dramatically. Mm-hmm. And the reason is, in part, and I mentioned this earlier to Ross Dellinger, the difficulty of recruiting has ratcheted up to probably the highest level it's ever been, because you've got Dabo, Kirby, and Saban there all at once. You don't have the kind of in-state talent that you have in those deep South states. So might it be something to really chew on and think about if you're a Tennessee fan or you're Phil Fulmer, to consider riding and dying with Jeremy Pruitt and just seeing how it plays out? Give him the year, give him another year.
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's totally worth it. I mean, you mentioned some of the challenges of Tennessee for sure. Clemson being a part of that, I think, is a way bigger story and a way bigger part of it than people realize, because, Clemson does dip into East Tennessee. They got T. Higgins out of there. It's not far from Knoxville. And I think the fact that Nashville is a booming city and Tennessee has yet to sort of lay a foundation in there is a big problem. Like that, the fact that it's sort of like a wild, wild west in a city like Nashville that's booming. Tennessee can't really find inroads there, or at least as much as maybe they should. even though it is, a couple hours away. But yeah, it's big. I mean, and the thing with Jeremy Pruitt, like, look, you kind of married yourself to rebuilding. He's a first-time head coach. He's going to make first-time head coach mistakes. He's going to run an offseason poorly. He did. Clearly, he ran an offseason poorly. They weren't ready for Georgia State. The other side of this is that maybe BYU's actually good.
Right.
I mean, they did beat USC last week.
Zach
you go
Wilson,
back and watch
man.
Like you go back and watch the Tennessee BYU game. Those Tennessee players played their tails off. I mean, the effort was there, and had it not been for a fluky play at the end, they would have won the game, right? And so, maybe BYU is actually good. And so I think the idea, and I'm guilty of this too, like maybe the idea that the sky is falling in Knoxville and the decade of dysfunction is going to extend for another decade. That was probably a little bit premature. Like, Jeremy's still young at this. He's still new at this. I had a first-time head coach tell me once that in the first game he had as a head coach, he forgot to send the punt team out 3 times. Like, right? Like, those are things you can't plan
muscle
for.
memory, right? You didn't
right?
have
Like,
it yet.
you don't know how to do that stuff yet. So I think they'll be fine. The idea that he's going to get fired, I think that's insane. It's not going to happen for a second-year coach like him. Now, a second-year coach like Willie Taggart, after what happened last year and what's going on this year, and no signs
and
of
an empty
improvement,
stadium.
An empty stadium.
Right.
That's problematic, sure.
Last thing, Alabama, they've lost 3 major contributors on defense. Is this serious? Are they in trouble?
I mean, not immediate trouble, no, because the guys that they have in there, they can play, but it's September. It's September, what is it, 18th right now. If you have, 4 freshmen in the front 7, and that's it, then that's a problem, because you're going to get banged up. They've already been banged up, obviously.
But do they have the talent? Do they have the talent to make up for those losses? I think.
No, because they don't have the
over
bodies.
the long term.
They don't have the bodies,
and that's been such a huge strength for
the
Saban.
bodies. Yeah, look, I mean, it's you even Alabama. You can sit here and say, okay, yeah, trot 5-star out there, he'll be fine. Trot Johnny 5-star out there as a backup, he'll be fine. Okay, but if that guy's a starter, then who's his backup? You don't have the bodies.
Well, and I think the untold story in the history of Nick Saban at the University of Alabama is depth, gray shirting, cutting players, doing what he does, and a lot of coaches do that. But I think if you go back and you look at the Rick years, Rick is getting beat on depth. He can play with Alabama in the first half.
Sure.
In the second half, forget about it. That's the untold story there. So,
well, can play with them for a full 4 quarters in the 2012 SEC championship game had it not been for a fluky tip. But you're right. I mean, that's the biggest thing, and then that's kind of why Georgia was never able to get over the hump, because they didn't have that. That's why Alabama's great now. It's why Clemson is what it is. It's why Georgia is what it is right now too, and Ohio State has been what it has been. So, I mean, yeah, like that's. But this is the year, though, where it's one thing to say, okay, you've got all this recruiting depth and this recruiting base, and you should be fine. Well, when it starts getting chipped away in mid-September, then it might become a problem in mid-October or mid-November, and I think that's where the tide sort of sits right now.
Barrett, thanks a lot, man. Thanks for jumping on. I hope to do this again with you. This is great.
All right, Brooks, anytime.
Barrett Sallee of CBS HQ, a great follow on Twitter. It's BARREE or BARRETTSALLEE on Twitter. And you see him all over CBS Sports Network if you have that on your cable system. And he's on all day, every day. He's at all the game sites, top of the line. Speaking of that, we got a guy over at ESPN on the SEC Network who is everywhere as well. We're going to be bringing up Peter Burns, a good friend of mine, who is one of the anchors, figuratively and literally, at SEC Network. He's the top fill-in for Paul Feinbaum on Feinbaum's show, rising star in sports media. Peter Burns is going to join us. You can bring him up, Cam. And Peter, how are you, buddy?
What's up, man? Good to finally talk some ball with you, man. It's this time of year, and I can kind of see you've been doing this, and it's awesome, man. It's week 4 and ready to rock and roll.
We're finally starting to get into it. We're finally starting to sink our teeth into some substantive stuff. So what are you looking at going into this weekend? Actually, the weekend starts tonight, tomorrow, but what are you really focusing on?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things is like this is finally the first weekend that I feel like we've had, a boatload of games that actually make sense, Brooks, right? Like that college football playoff is going to be kind of decided this week. I mean, it starts with Georgia, Notre Dame, obviously the big game in Athens, and it's crazy. I mean, it's funny about, I think both Notre Dame and Georgia in years past, Brooks, we've talked so much about these teams, right? Like, It was about Notre Dame last year and what they were doing. And, Mike Golick and Golick Jr. are bumping their gums about how good the Irish are. And we're talking about Kirby Smart and his second year and Jake Fromm. Yet I feel like because of LSU's storyline, Alabama and Clemson and all these, and Jalen Hurts, I feel like these are two programs that we really haven't talked a whole hell of a lot about so far this season. And it's weird because I think at least Georgia's national title contender. I mean, I look at that offensive line, Brooks, man, it looks like a bunch of sumo wrestlers right now. I mean, it's unbelievable the size advantage that they have. And Cole Kublik, our friend from SEC Network, brought it up a couple of days ago about how many long runs the Irish have already given up. I think it's like 13 runs of 10 yards or more, and they've only played 2 games. So to me, I think that's a huge deal when you look at the Bulldogs having some success. I don't think they've been tested yet. I mean, have you seen anything enough of Georgia Bulldogs that makes you think, they're not really one of these top 5 teams right now?
No, absolutely not. And I just can't wait to get back to, the second half of the season. I'm dreaming about LSU playing Alabama in particular, because I think I was texting with a friend of mine who works in the LSU athletic department yesterday. And this has nothing to do with right now, but the LSU Alabama matchup, and you see Alabama's got some problems on defense that could be severe problems potentially down the line when it comes to depth, when it comes to talent. And you look at LSU's offense, you look at Tua. I mean, it's going to be an exciting year. But let's talk a little bit about A&M and Auburn
this week. Yeah,
Auburn going down to A&M, and that's somewhat of an elimination game, you would say, with the college football playoff.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't know if I thought of either A&M or if I thought of A&M or Auburn as true college football playoff contenders. I think they're kind of playing more of the spoiler role, right? Like coming into this year. So I think both of those teams can be an issue going forward. But it's kind of crazy when you look at it. The home team has not had much of an advantage over the last couple of years. I think the road team has lost 6 of the last 7 in that matchup. So that to me, that's just nuts when you think about, Auburn being a loud place to play and even A&M being a loud place to play. But I think the only true thing I really know in that game is that Auburn's defense is legit, right? Like that's the one thing that I if you could say, what are you certain on? To be honest with you, is that Auburn's defense is going to be fantastic with Derek Brown.
So maybe the performance by Herbert of Oregon might not be as bad as people think.
No, I don't think so. In fact, I go back and look at it, Brooks, and you go back and watch that game. I think Oregon, really what it came down to, they just didn't have the depth late into that game, and because they looked at it as explosive as anybody. And so I never really took away from that Oregon-Auburn game early in the season that, Oregon's just a fraud. Oregon's just not very good.
Ask Nevada if they're a fraud, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, and I go back and look at, I kind of felt that way when I saw Washington early. Like I saw them put up a monster numbers with Jacob Eason against like Eastern Washington. I'm like, everybody's like, oh, look at the Huskies. I didn't, look at what Cal was able to do to them. And so I was never buying Washington, but I do buy Oregon. And that's why, going forward, I think that Utah-USC game is going to be important for the Pac-12. But for this game, when it comes down to it, I got to find out if Kellen Mond is the real deal. Because this is a game that you have to take that next step. And if you're Kellen Mond, it sucks because you lose Jayshon Corbin, their starting running back. And so they're going to have this kid, Isaiah Spiller, which Jimbo likes. But Jimbo's also running, Brooks, a lot of really young guys in there in the first 2 years of his program. Because I think he knows no one expected them to win the SEC this year and last year and this year. So I think right now it's almost like a 2-year preseason for Jimbo Fisher in which he's trying to get as many young guys reps. So by 2021, he's got a team that can compete for a college football title. I don't think they could do that right now.
Yeah, and in a sense, that really difficult schedule, it's kind of the bad news, but it's also somewhat of the good news because it brings down those expectations as far as A&M is concerned. And now when you look at a Willie Taggart and that situation at Florida State, I think you have that much more of an appreciation for Jimbo Fisher and what he did at Florida State, not having necessarily the facilities and the resources that you're going to have at A&M. And I've been saying from day one when Jimbo came into the conference, don't be deceived. I mean, I think LSU is going to be jumping into that college football playoff picture, I think, as early as this year. It might be a year before they get there. Right. But I think A&M is on the precipice of getting to the college football playoff picture every year. Do you think that's possible, though? I'm asking you.
I mean, I brought this up in the offseason when they hired kind of right before this season started. I thought if I was buying stock in a team in which I could find value of,
Yeah, I always do that.
I was like, A&M is the one that I'm buying stock on. But I'm not getting any value out of Clemson and Alabama just because, they're the Google, they're the Apple stocks, right? Like you can't really see that upside. You just know they're good for your portfolio.
Who are you shorting, by the way? Who are you shorting? Auburn?
No, you know what? And I know that
Florida? I'm shorting Florida right now.
I'm shorting Florida this season, Brooks, but not, I got to be honest with you. I like what Dan Mullen has brought. So I think that he ended up being the perfect hire for this. Sorry, I'm all over the map here.
That's all right.
With my thing. I don't know if I'm shorting that. I going back to what I'm buying for Texas A&M is the fact that you have the facilities that are unbelievable. You have a recruiting base that's rich, right, in the Houston, Texas, Louisiana area.
Doesn't get any richer.
No, right? That's as good as you're going to get. You also have a coach that has been there before. And I think maybe the most important thing, you don't have unfair expectations. Like at Alabama and Clemson, it's pass or fail right now. Like there's like, hey, we've been to the mountaintop. If we don't get there, it just sucks. The year was a failure. For A&M, they haven't experienced that. They had the success of Johnny Manziel, but it never really, it wasn't a SEC championship type thing. For them, the ride that A&M can go on is going to be fascinating because I think that they are a team that by 2022, 2023, if Nick Saban calls it a day, well, all of a sudden, I think it's LSU and Texas A&M are going to be the powerhouses in the SEC West, and I think Alabama will eventually take a step back.
What about LSU? What's your assessment of? I mean, they put up the big numbers, but what's your assessment of that team? Are they a college football playoff team?
Defensively, not necessarily yet, but at least they have an offense, right? I mean, hell,
a real offense.
Yeah, I mean, Brooks, the worst thing that almost happened to LSU was going down to Tuscaloosa in 2011 and winning 9-6. Right? Like they Bama'd in Tuscaloosa, and for almost a full decade, Brooks, they tried to do that. And we're like, crap, man, you can't continue to do that. It feels like LSU,
now why is that? It's because you're not going to get the level of depth in recruiting?
I think that is definitely a part of it. And also, I'm a firm believer that when it comes down to it, no one's going to play the Alabama style football or what we knew Alabama football to be in 2012 and 2013, which is great run defense and great running the ball. LSU was trying to do that. And here's the thing. I'm really curious what would have happened had Lane Kiffin decided not to take the FAU job. You and I think we're in the same boat here. I think it was going to be a package deal. I think it was going to be Ed Ogeron and Lane Kiffin going to LSU in 2016. That was part of the deal that was sold to Joe Oliva. I think Lane wanted it to happen. I think he wanted to get out of Tuscaloosa, and I think he was basically ready to go. So he was going to bring this style offense to LSU. But then whether Jimmy Sexton or whatever, the FAU job came up, and he says, you know what? I want to take that job. I want to hurry up and fast track getting back into being on this upper echelon. He took that job, and it's not really worked out. I mean, do you believe? I think LSU's offense would have looked a whole lot different 2 years ago had they not had to scramble in five-man Canada and had it been Lane Kiffin running those
maybe not. I'm not necessarily as sold on Lane Kiffin as you are as an offensive mind, and I'm not that sold on Sark either. But when it comes to LSU, I'm just trying to figure out if this team has what it takes to get to the college football playoff, to get through Tuscaloosa this year. And, of course, you've got the problems on defense now with Alabama. It's early in the season. Normally, Alabama's stacked. They don't have to worry about depth, but suddenly they do. You come out of the Clemson game, there's some chinks in the armor. You've got a constant fluid situation with the coaching staff. I mean, are they really vulnerable? Because I don't think South Carolina did what they were capable of doing against Alabama. They had some problems there. Are we seeing a moment where we could start to see a changing of the guard here with Alabama?
Well, I mean, that's what it happened.
Or maybe with Georgia, too.
Well, and listen, here's the deal. They're going to have, four possible freshmen. You can hear my dogs in the background. They didn't even like what you had to say there. LeBron Ray, that injury that the Tide just had, combined that with Joshua McMillan and Dylan Moses, they're going to be having four freshmen on the front seven. And, I mean, basically, LSU and Alabama have brought Big 12 offenses to the SEC. Is that fair? I mean, I think they look like a Big 12 offense. The problem is they're kind of brought a Big 12 defense to it right now as well.
Right. Which is, ironic because normally LSU, the strength is going to be on defense. The strength is going to be on the talent and the recruiting more so than the refinement of the coaching. I want to ask you, and we're talking to Peter Burns, of course, SEC Network. He's the face of SEC Network as far as I'm concerned. And I want to ask you, though, specifically about, because I think this is one of the best stories of college football this year. You got Steve Emsinger and you have Joe Brady. It's like a buddy cop movie,
right?
And they're tweeting back and forth to each other. But what about Joe Brady? How long? First of all, where is he? Give us a little background on him. And is he going to stay put? What's the story with that guy's career? Why did he leave New Orleans and the Saints to come here? And what's his MO?
Yeah, the MO, and that's basically what the backstory is that he had an opportunity. Orgeron knew he had to do something on offense, right? So he went in and he asked Brady to come in and say, hey, will you do a presentation about RPOs to LSU football? He did it, and all of a sudden, Orgeron was like, holy hell, man, we got to find a way to get
But wait a minute, he's with
the
New Orleans Saints.
Right.
But he's with the New Orleans Saints. Why would he go to LSU?
Well, but the thing is that Orgeron just literally, before he even thought about offering the job, right? Yeah, I mean, he said, hey, come on in and just let me see if I can learn how about this RPO. Like, how can I institute and get our playmakers into space? So he brings Brady in. Brady does his presentation, and all of a sudden it's like, wow, we gotta get this guy. Now, for Brady, you got to realize a lot of people thought, okay, he was running the offense. He was just the passing game coordinator for the Saints. So for Brady, it's not only a little bit more bump in money, it's an opportunity to put his hands on an offense that the bar was set so flippin' low on. No matter how good you did, it had to probably be better than what it was before. And so now it's a perfect storm for him, because I think this is a situation where if you get Brady for 2 years and him and Ensminger work really well together, sooner or later someone's going to give him an OC job, or someone's going to give him a more of an opportunity to. I don't know if he's ready to be a head coach. He's 29 years old, but this is the resume that Brady's going to bring to LSU football, and he's brought it to the 21st century. It's like they gave him LASIK vision, the LASIK surgery for this offense, right? They've been blind as hell for the longest time, and all of a sudden they came out, and LSU fans were like, damn, I can finally see. And I think the thing is it looks easy, Brooks. That's the thing to me. Like, it's not manufactured offense. It's Burrow is got that middle finger mentality. He's got, this is the offense I like to run.
But how much of it is, I was just going to ask you, how much is it Burrow and how much is it the scheme?
I think it's a perfect mix of both, honestly. And I'm not trying to cop out. I'm not trying to say, hey, you could just plug and play. Because when Miles Brennan, the backup quarterback for LSU, goes in, it looks good, but it doesn't look the same, right? It's not as crisp. I think Burrow is as important with his arm. I think the mindset of Joe Burrow is what LSU really needed. And I go back and look at the first game that he played last year. It was against Miami. And, here's this kid, this transfer from Ohio State. How much does he care about LSU, or does he just want to play ball? And he's out there.
Ohio kid. He's an Ohio guy.
Yeah. We're going to need to tell Colin Coward that. I don't know if Colin Coward
Right. No kidding. I saw that yesterday. Embarrassing.
But right off the get-go, he's jawing at Miami players, and then you combine that with the fact that people are like, all right, this is my guy right off the bat. Like, he's all in on this team. And you go back and look, he threw a pick six, I think, in the game against UCF in the bowl game, and he got absolutely clobbered. I mean, should be out for the season. I mean, just a scary, scary hit. He got up, and it was almost like, all right, now let's do this. And he led LSU to a bowl victory. And I think that team has rallied behind his mind and his mindset as much as they have the arm and scheme. And that's why LSU is a true college football playoff contender right now.
Help me understand Tennessee, because they looked better last week. And this is a coach in training situation, clearly, almost much more so than anybody had imagined. I think Georgia State underlined that. But how much talent do they actually have? And what do you think the potential of that coaching staff is to get better?
Honestly, listen, when you look at, Jim Chaney run the offense and what he did at Georgia, he's talented enough to make that happen. I go back and look at not having Daniel Batuli on that defense was a game changer. Like, legitimately, they were playing a bunch of younger guys the first 2 weeks. And I think that they thought, Brooks, that they were talented enough that they could just show up, right? All right, well, they get handed to them in an embarrassing loss. And then BYU is a sneaky team. I mean, look at what they did last week to USC. I mean, that's a legit team. So I go back and look, all right, they were in that game. I think that this Florida-Tennessee game is closer than the Georgia-Notre Dame game this weekend, right? I think Georgia has success against Notre Dame early and often. I think that Florida better be on upset alert because I think Tennessee has enough talent. You get Patulli back, and I think that they're able to have enough playmakers. This isn't a team like Arkansas last year where they're just void of talent, right?
Right.
And even maybe Willie Taggart in his first year where it's just an absolute dumpster fire. I think that for the Vols, they're actually a fairly talented team, especially when the wide receiver group, that they are getting things back together. So I don't think this is a 2-10 team. I still think it's a 6-6 team. It was just, everybody wanted to talk about it because everybody, A, doesn't like the SEC, which I understand, and B, we love to see big time programs falter. I mean, if it bleeds, it leads in media, and Tennessee has bled a lot over the last couple seasons.
Right. We're with Peter Burns, SEC Network. One more thing for you.
Yeah.
When I ask you about South Carolina and Will Muschamp, of course, you have Florida. Now you have South Carolina. Was that disaster against – I think it was a disaster against Alabama. South Carolina should have been in that game. It should have been much closer. Was that a defining moment for Will Muschamp's coaching career? Is this the beginning of the end for him?
I think it's an important game this weekend against Missouri, right? Missouri's I think almost a 10-point favorite to go up to Como, which I think Kelly Bryant, those guys got everything figured out after the Wyoming loss. If he can show that they can bounce back after that game against Alabama, which had some questionable calls, it's huge. I still think Ray Tanner, who their athletic director, he knows it's about patience, and he sees that the program's deeper, but that doesn't necessarily mean wins. I don't think there's a whole lot of pressure on Will right now. Hey, you got to win right now. They just got a football facility. I still think that Will at least get not only this season, but the following season as well to have his whole vision there. And at the end of 2020, Brooks, hey man, maybe it is time for a change, but I'm not willing to sell Muschamp, especially with the schedule that they had, and say that he's not cut out to be a coach. And I've said this often, and it sucks because we value college football so much on wins and losses, and that's basically what you're paid for, right? But off the field, I'm getting ready to have a son and on Halloween. I can't wait.
Congratulations, that's
Thanks,
awesome,
dude. It'll be great. And I don't know if he plays college football, but if there was one college football coach that I would want him to play for, take the wins and losses out, it's actually Will Muschamp. Not Nick Saban,
Really?
Not Ed Ogeron.
Not Dabo?
Not Dabo. Honestly,
Really?
it's Will Muschamp.
Because everybody says Dabo. Everybody said when they ask that question.
Listen, you're not going to go wrong with Dabo, right? I just think the time that I've spent with Muschamp, and I'll never forget this. The time I went with him when he first took over the job, and I sat down, he invited me to come down on signing day, his first signing day. And we sat down, and he started kind of, he opened up because we had some mutual friends, and he was great. And he was telling me the stories about how, hey man, we're probably not going to get this kid because this kid is, hey, he wanted extra, he wanted cash. Now we're not on camera, so this is just me and him talking. And he's telling me about this kid wanted me to recruit his brother, but I knew if I recruited his brother, I'd sign his brother and the kid wouldn't come. So I really got a glimpse inside of how Muschamp runs his
Very
program.
candid. You're not going to get that.
You don't get it a lot.
That's pretty rare.
And I've been down there in practices, and I think he's just a good coach. The problem is that Clemson's a damn behemoth now, and the rest of the SEC are a bunch of super yachts and 1%ers, and he's still right? I mean, it's like going to San Tropez.
Oligarchs.
Yeah,
Oligarchs.
really, right? It's like, college football has a lot of really good programs that have nice boats. But guess what? Clemson's a damn, $50 million Tiger Woods boat in the marina right now. And so is Alabama, and LSU is that way. So, I think he's a great coach. I just think that, I don't think there's a whole lot of pressure on him. And I don't know what happens. I saw your deal. I know you got to run real quick, but I saw your deal about, Bob Stoops and Auburn. And, I think that's what makes Auburn so dangerous this year is I think Malzahn, once he signed that deal, is kind of like, you know what? I'm playing with house money. I'm going to coach the way I want to coach. We're going to have a true freshman. We're going to run this offense. And when his back's up against the wall like 2017, that's when Gus and those guys are extremely dangerous.
What about Bo Nix? Assess him for us because he's an X factor.
Yeah, I think that Malzahn's been around enough offense where he knows if a guy has it or not. I think Nick's does. It's just it's the fact that we've gotten so spoiled with the Trevor Lawrences of the world and Tua coming in as a true freshman and lighting the world on fire that we look at Bo Nix and go, well, why isn't this guy the greatest thing since sliced bread? He's a damn true freshman, and so I think that he'll have success. I think that he's going to make some mistakes. He's already made those mistakes right now. That's why it's so important and so disheartening for Auburn in the last couple of weeks. They haven't been able to run the ball real well. They need to do that against A&M. I think that they do have success, and I think they go into College Station and win. And Nix has a stat line of like 11 of 16 for 165 yards, but it's good enough to kind of grow, kind of like Jake Fromm was maybe the first year under Chaney in Athens.
What about the ceiling, though, for Nix? What is his ceiling?
High. I mean, I look at Nix being a very Jake Fromm type quarterback in the fact that if you build enough around him, I don't think he's a Heisman Trophy guy. I don't think he's the guy who's going to say, okay, hey, this is, going to give us 500 yards of total offense every week. But I think he's enough that he's going to create an issue for people. And I think he's a little bit better passer than Nick Marshall. I mean, I think he can be a much better passer than Nick Marshall, but I think he also has the kind of the movement in the pocket that Marshall can bring as well too. So again, I like where Auburn's at right now. And I know, again, everybody can say, hey, they want to go hire the next Bob Stoops of the world. And that's one thing. The issue with Auburn football right now is they got too many cooks in the kitchen that aren't a part of the athletic department. It's the boosters that want to go and say, hey, this is how we should run things. And that's only hurt Auburn in that football program to have that much smoke around that environment.
Thanks to guys like me, right?
But that's what's happening. I mean, you're not making
happening.
Stuff out of thin air. I mean,
I'm not.
These are legitimately the conversations that are having boosters.
Well, and Peter, they're somewhat understandable because these are contingency plans. That's really what this is, and so it's targeting a guy like Stoops. It doesn't mean they're going to get him, but I can tell you personally, and I've mentioned this on the show here, that it's not just Stoops. I mean, he's canvassing, and you know what they're doing? They're doing the same thing at Tennessee, and they're doing the same. And Deion Sanders is doing, and I mean that literally. No, Deion Sanders is doing the same thing at Florida State.
You always kick the tires. I'll ask Greg Byrne, the athletic director at University of Alabama. He's got Nick Saban, arguably the greatest coach in the history of all time. He's always kicking the tires, right? There's always conversations that be had. Every single athletic director has.
That's how you get a good hire. That's how you make a good hire.
And exactly, that's how you don't end up like, oh, I don't know who we should hire now. Let's start
search firm.
Yeah, I mean, you have to have those conversations. The problem is that people don't like it when it's out in the public. But guess what? That's how the real world of college football works, and I'm glad you're bringing it up to the forefront.
I appreciate it, Peter, man. Thanks so much for stopping by, and hope to do this again, man. And congratulations on everything in the SEC network. Man, outstanding job.
We're having a blast, and I love what you're doing. Look, it's great to talk ball with you, buddy. Let's do it again soon.
Stirring it up. Thanks, Peter. Take care,
you,
man.
Right,
That's Peter Burns of SEC Network joining us here on Sports by Brooks on Fancred. Do it every day. Noon to 2 Eastern, at noon to 1:30, 2 o'clock. Usually we cut out a little bit before 2 o'clock. Hope you'll come in and join us every single weekday. And what a guest lineup we've had. We've talked college football with Ross Dellinger. We just talked it with Peter Burns. And, of course, we talked NFL earlier with Albert Breer. And Barrett Salee also dropped by from CBS Sports Network and CBS Sports HQ. We mixed it up talking college football as well, as we're getting into our first big weekend of college football. Some intriguing matchups in the SEC, a very, very intriguing matchup. One of the better Pac-12 games for my money of the year, because perhaps it's still early. And they haven't started knocking each other off at the Pac-12 when you've got a USC against Utah. And so what I want to do is I want to elaborate a little bit more on USC because I haven't had a chance up until now. I wanted to get into specifics as it pertains to the coaching search at USC. I went on and on earlier about who's behind that coaching search. Rick Caruso and the Board of Trustees and Wayne Hughes, also in the Board of Trustees, both billionaires, I might add. They are behind normally the head coach hires, right? They're the ones that are out making the contacts, doing the scouting. Now, they'll hire a search firm as cover, and that can be supplementary to what's happening. But make no mistake, it's the board of trustees that's going to make that hire, primarily the guys that have all the money. That's how it works. It's not going to be the athletic director. And, it depends on the situation. But at USC particularly, it has not come through the athletic department. We had Lynn Swan, who was all but a figurehead as the AD, recently let go. One thing to really look at closely is who comes in as AD. That will be a litmus test to see where we are in terms of the power structure. There's a struggle going on for power right now between the new president, Carol Folt, University of North Carolina, doesn't subscribe to the kind of incestuous power arrangement that they have and have had for decades. In my lifetime, essentially, at USC, things are changing because of the lawsuits, the college admission scandal. They're going to pay out $500 million because of class action suits against the university because of malfeasance by various USC personnel, professors, and whatnot. That's coming. That's happening right now. And so bringing in a Carol Folt, someone who is agnostic as it pertains to USC, is part of cleaning up the image as far as the school is concerned. All right. So you have Carol Folt, who does not want to hire Urban Meyer. I know that for a fact. The sources told me that. You have the board of trustees. They want to hire Urban Meyer. I think an X factor is going to be how much power is Carol Folt going to have going forward? How much credibility, how much influence is she going to have with other trustees who might not be involved in the push for Urban Meyer? You also have former college football players who played at USC, prominent alumni, former players who are weighing in on this situation. And don't underestimate, without an athletic director right now, I want to point that out. I should have pointed that out at the beginning, but there is no AD at USC right now, and they're in the process of hiring one. So because of that, you've got this free-for-all right now, and it's not a given. It's not a given that a coach, that an AD has to be hired to make that coach hire at USC. Who knows? Anything is possible. All right. But I can tell you that Rick Caruso and company, they're reaching out and they're assessing coaching candidates. Right. And you've got to take a look at some of the assistants around the country to understand the possible replacements for Clay Helton. All right. So when you look at the USC situation, you've got Urban Meyer, right? You got a very attractive job, depending on who the AD is. And then you're going to look at some of the top assistants around college football. You're not going to look at Bob Stoops. He's not coming to USC. And so right now, for my money, when you talk about some of the better college assistants who are out there, you've got a guy at Clemson, Tony Elliott, offensive coordinator, who has had a lot of success coming into Southern California and taking recruits out of Southern California back to Clemson. Tony Elliott has California roots, lived here until he was 10 years old. He's a guy that you've got to look at. And you've also got some other top assistants out there. The defensive coordinator at Washington right now, who's the highest paid defensive coordinator in the country right now. I should say the Pac-12. He's a possibility as a potential candidate for the USC head coaching job. So you've got some top assistants who are possibilities at USC. And when you bring in an athletic director, all right, that person's going to want to, you would think, establish their own power base. Are they going to play the same old game that we've had at USC over the years? Are they just going to go along with the whale donors? Or are we ushering in a new age? I think we are. Because I think Carol Folt is cut from a different cloth. She's not a function of fundraising. She's not just fundraising as a guy like Max Nikias was, who she's succeeding. Max Nikias was very close with Wayne Hughes, who has given $400 million to USC. Nikias is gone. So Carol Folt comes in. She comes in as a somewhat disinterested third party. I think you're going to see an athletic director along those lines hired who doesn't necessarily have deep or any USC connections. And if that happens, I don't think Urban Meyer is going to get hired. I don't. And I think you may continue to have things bleeding out, coming out about Urban Meyer, about his past at Ohio State, about the cover-up as it pertains to Zach Smith, continuing to come out. Courtney Smith, by the way, Zach Smith's wife, ex-wife, right, is on Twitter. Who knows what's going to happen with that, right? So with that specter hanging over Urban Meyer, I think Urban Meyer realizes that he's going to have to do a sales job. And I think his job at Fox, we're going to see him at the USC-Utah game. How uncomfortable is that? We've got Urban Meyer at USC with Reggie Bush covering the game for Fox. Extraordinary, because Bush is banned from being associated with USC, if you don't already know, for life. Reggie Bush is not allowed on campus because of past NCAA violations. Can you believe that? Ridiculous. So you've got Urban Meyer looming, hovering. And a recent article that came out in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, authored by Doug Lesmerises. He did an interview with Urban Meyer, and it was very clear that Urban Meyer wants to come back and coach college football from the rhetoric. And we'll get into some of the quotes. We're actually going to have Doug Lesmerises on from the Cleveland Plain Dealer. He's going to come on the show tomorrow, and he's going to talk about his experience with Urban Meyer, what his feel for it is, and some of the provocative statements that Urban Meyer said about missing coaching that made it clear to me that he was making everybody aware that he wants to get back into coaching. And there's only one place left for him to go. He's not going to go to the SEC. Understand, Urban Meyer's not going back to the SEC. He's not going back to the Big Ten. He's not going to the ACC. That would be a nightmare when you've got Clemson there. It sets up perfectly for him with the Pac-12 and SC. Now the question is, what happens? Who emerges from this power struggle? How soon do we have an athletic director? What sort of athletic director do you get? What's the background? And again, I mentioned some possible candidates, some possible top prospects as they pertain to head coaching candidates. There could also be coaches of lower level FBS programs that gain consideration, hot coaches, if you will. So don't rule that out. Don't rule that out as far as USC is concerned. And again, a name to remember who is at the very top, arguably the hottest assistant coach right now in college football being considered for jobs. I mean, you've got guys like Brent Venables, of course, perennial coaching possibility candidate for a head coaching job as the defensive coordinator at Clemson. But on the offensive side of the ball, you've got the recruiting coordinator for Clemson, who also is the offensive coordinator. And you know what that offense has done. Tony Elliott, he's a possibility. I think he could be in the mix when it comes to USC and possibly other schools. But USC really is a plump job, and it's a sleeping giant. Just redid the stadium. So coming up, we're going to visit and we're going to talk some NFL, hopefully with Curt Menefee of Fox Sports. Of course, he is one of the main hosts of Fox NFL Sunday, and we're excited to have him. And so he's going to be joining us on your Fancred app that you're watching me on right now. And pleasant surprise to have Curt on. Been a big fan of his work over the years. And we're going to talk about some of the big goings on in the NFL. We covered that with Burt Breer earlier. And so we'll talk a little bit more, I think, about the games with Curt Menefee, beginning with the Jags and the Titans tonight. And of course, everybody's wondering about the status of Jalen Ramsey. And of course, as I'm on the air here, kind of on lockdown throughout the course of the show, not always following the very latest, but I do see now that that Ian Rappaport is reporting that Ramsey is planning to play tonight. And Jacksonville has told interested teams to reassess the situation on Friday. And Rappaport is reporting that basically every team is inquiring about the services of Jalen Ramsey. Josina Anderson, crack reporter for ESPN, is reporting that Kansas City, Baltimore, Minnesota, Oakland, Philadelphia, and Seattle have all made substantive inquiries She also adds, but my understanding is almost every team has placed a call to Jacksonville for the services of Jalen Ramsey, which is really amazing and makes you kind of wonder if Jacksonville's doing the right thing. Interested to get Kurt's perspective on that, what he thinks about that situation. In addition to some of the big games coming up on the NFL schedule, which begins tonight with the Jags and, of course, the Titans. And also want to talk a little bit about the Antonio Brown situation with him, perhaps. And one of the big games, I think the biggest game of the Sunday schedule, is going to be involving the Chiefs and the Ravens. And I'm really interested to find out, what he thinks about Lamar Jackson and Cam Newton, because that's been an ongoing story, especially Cam Newton. So we're going to bring Kurt Menefee up from Fox NFL Sunday, longtime host, somebody you watch every single Sunday, and talk some National Football League with us. Hey, Kurt, I really appreciate the time, bud. Thanks so much for joining us.
No problem. I didn't realize I had to download the app first, so I would have been here sooner.
No, it's outstanding to have you, and a big fan of your work. And of course, Fox NFL Sunday really has set the standard for a long time when it comes to NFL coverage. What are your thoughts about this game tonight? Of course, everybody talking about Jalen Ramsey, the Jags and the Titans.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those that you take a look at it, and I'm interested to see if Ramsey plays, how he plays. Because I think we've kind of gotten into an era where, and I don't mind, I know that people have kind of gone back and forth with it, particularly this week. Look, the NFL's been influenced by the NBA, and I think we could see that coming last year. I really do. And players now are making it clear if they're in a situation they're not happy with, they want out. So how do you get out? Well, we've seen Antonio Brown's approach, to getting out of where he didn't want to be. But we've also seen other guys, you look at a guy like Minka Fitzpatrick who got out last week, but, who was the perfect soldier all the way through. And so I'm interested to see how Ramsey performs tonight. I think once he gets on the field, one would assume that the type of player he is, he's, one of the best, if not the best corner in the league, that he probably will perform well. But again, I think in this day and age, it's not guaranteed. And the reality is the NFL has become as much about drama as it is about football lately,
Yeah, it seems like it. Now, one thing I'll say about the NBA, I can't remember a time when I wasn't more excited about an upcoming NBA season. And so for all the consternation, I think, amongst the sports media about what's going on in the NBA, what perhaps is wrong with the NBA, and maybe that we've overcorrected with NBA player empowerment, I think there's something to be said for players having more of a say as partners with the league.
I think there's something to be said about players having more control of their lives. I think, look, let's be honest. Whatever business you are, and I always use a bank as an example. If you work for Bank of America and they told you had to stay there until they decided you couldn't work there, now people want to talk about compensation and whatever. Your compensation is in line with everybody else who does your job. So you're making the same thing as everyone else who works at Bank of America or at Chase or whatever. But if you don't want to work at Bank of America anymore and leave and go to Chase, you can. Sports is the only place where we expect people to stay where they are until the team tells them they can go somewhere else, or until they hit a certain number of years and that kind of thing. So I have no problem with it. The only thing I don't like as a fan, and really it's starting to become the NFL now, but being an NBA fan, is that to me, these super teams, if you will, make the regular season kind of ho-hum.
Right.
I think that we know you could drop right now which teams are going to be in the playoffs in the NBA. So for me, until it's April, I'm kind of like, okay, so what? And I don't want the NFL to get to that point, because I think one of the great things about the NFL is that every single game matters. Every game is important. And I don't want to lose that, because you've got a team like Miami who is, waving the white flag and not even trying to be competitive. And if you have that spread and you've got more and more teams, well, then all of a sudden, here we are week 3, and, they've been embarrassed the last 2 weeks, and now everybody on their schedule just checks them off. We've always had bad teams, but you've never had a team being this intentionally bad. And that's my fear going down the road. It's not about player empowerment. It's about the competitive nature of the sport.
Yeah, and of course, we've got all the quarterbacks going down.
Yeah.
What kind of impact do you think that's going to have league-wide on interest in the league, if any?
Yeah, I think look, the casual fan, the quarterbacks of these teams. particularly the marquee teams. And so I think it could have an impact there. But the one great thing about it is first of all, if you look, we keep getting guys that come up. You look at 12 months ago, maybe. I guess Mahomes had played 2 games at that point, if you want to go 12 months exactly. But 2 weeks before that, we were all, okay, let's see what this Mahomes kid can do. Now he's must-see TV. So I don't think the door is closed. We got a lot of, you look at, what Kyler Murray's doing. He's up and down, but he should be. He's a rookie. He's played 2 games. But you look at Lamar Jackson, you look at other players around the league, Carson Wentz.
Changing of the guard, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, I think we look at the guys who've been there forever, because everybody's not Tom Brady. Because Tom Brady plays till he's 42, he's in great shape, he's able to do these things. We assume everybody else can. But they can't. I mean, Drew Brees is 40. He'll be 41 in January. At Eli Manning, you look at Ben Roethlisberger. I mean, those guys are 37. Guys didn't play a decade ago until they were 37 years old. So I think, yes, there's more nutrition and there's better workouts and all that kind of stuff. But, Father Time's undefeated. And at some point, these guys move on and we bring in the next crop. And I think we're just kind of seeing that unfold before our eyes. But because we live in a day and age where everybody debates everything, they want to make it be the end of the world. And, oh, my gosh, Eli Manning's not starting now. Ben Roethlisberger's not starting.
I think we're all pulled.
Which people do on Sunday, by the way, as well.
Of course. And we're all pulled towards that nostalgia. And this game is built on nostalgia. And I think you guys are a good balance of that, And one of the games, I think, when you talk about the new NFL, if you will, the new guard, if you will, coming in with quarterbacks is what could be the game of the year, but people aren't really portraying it that way. And I'm a little surprised it's not getting more play as the Ravens and the Chiefs. Mm-hmm. Maybe because people are still sleeping on Lamar Jackson a little bit.
I think people are still waiting to see if not only Lamar Jackson's real, but this Ravens offense, because they have 1-2 games against Miami and Arizona. So I think people aren't willing to jump on that bandwagon just yet. But I think if you look at, during training camp and preseason, the Ravens, if you talk to anybody who's with that organization, they were raving about Lamar Jackson and what a difference he would be in year 2, because, he physically changed his body, because he understands the offense. I also think if you look at it, and a guy like Greg Roman, and I think we sometimes put coaches on a pedestal and don't give athletes enough credit, but I do think that here's a guy who's the offensive coordinator with Baltimore, who, when he had Colin Kaepernick as his quarterback, found a unique skill set and a way to use it to get a team to the Super Bowl. And I think he deserves some credit for being able to do the same thing with Lamar Jackson, at least thus far, is to find a guy who's got a unique skill set and just, okay, so I'm not worried about my system, so to speak. I'm worried about how can I get the most out of this player. And Roman's done that. And, again, if you want to talk about coaches, John Harbaugh deserves some credit because midway through last season, he realized that he didn't have the right coach to do this. Let me get the guy in the right position to make this work. And they've done that, I think.
As we look at the Chiefs now, I don't think a lot of people have talked about the defense in the way that they talked about it last year. It was a total disaster most of the season. You can make an argument that's why they didn't go to the Super Bowl. Do you think things might be different this year?
Oh, I think they are. I think they already are. I think when you take a look at them, and that's another team that when I saw them in training camp, and I'm not a huge social media guy, but I remember putting on, I go, I think this team is the best team in football, and they've got a chance to break offensive records if they stay healthy. But I think part of the reason is because they've improved themselves on defense. They got better up front in getting Frank Clark, and they improved themselves in the secondary with Tyrann Mathieu and the way they drafted. And I think you take a look and they got faster at linebacker, but all they had to do was be basically one possession better each game. If they are 1 or 2 possessions better, probably nobody's going undefeated. But if you look at the way they lost games, they certainly would not have lost that AFC Championship game and been in the Super Bowl. And so they didn't have to go from 0 to 50. They just had to go from 30 to 50. And I think they've done that, and they've gotten markedly better. That's going to be a defense that will always give up points, because when you're scoring 40 points, the opposition is going to be on the field a lot. So they're never going to be one of those shut-down defense that holds someone to 14, 13 points. That's just not the way a team is built. But I think they're good enough to win games each and every week, 30 to 20, 31 to 21, and that's how they're playing.
Talking to Kurt Menefee of Fox NFL Sunday, I want to talk to you about Cam Newton, who is kind of a lightning rod in sports media, and for a lot of different reasons. My thought on it briefly before I ask you about him is now we find out that he's got a foot problem. He mentioned that he had a foot problem last year. he clearly had a severe arm problem. And my assessment of sports media and evaluating how we're evaluating him is I think we're coming down on him a little unfairly in that we're not bringing to the fore those injuries enough as it relates to how he's playing. If you want to talk about why his career may be over, which I'm amazingly hearing from people early in the season after just his second performance, I think you've got to put it in the context of the injuries. That's not what I'm hearing. I'm hearing more about it's Cam being selfish, it's Cam's his abilities and things like that, where I think we're giving short shrift to those injuries.
Well, look, I will say, and I try to keep up as to what's going on during the week, but I've only heard one person say that, and that was Paul Feinbaum, about the personality aspect of it. And I think Paul's more of a college guy than an NFL guy. Doesn't mean he's not a fan, doesn't mean he doesn't do his homework. But I think that I would take that with a grain of salt, because I think most people around the NFL do look at it and say it's because of injury. And it's a matter of, we lauded this guy for being a special physical specimen, for not running out of bounds, for lowering his shoulders, for taking the hits. Well, after a while, you can't be Superman forever. And the question is, did he develop enough of the rest of his game? I think that's what people were kind of waiting to see coming into this year, because I think we started to see with these shoulder surgeries and the foot injuries and the little nicks that he can't play that way probably anymore, and not on a full-time basis. So can he take the next step, especially if people thought Norv Turner comes in, he'll develop the other parts of his game. And I think a lot of people were kind of looking at this as a prove-it year for him, if you will. And being hurt right on the stretch, well, he's not able to prove it right now because he's not physically able to be on the field, where narratives then start to run crazy because people wanted him to be able to do something, and 2 weeks into it, he can't do what they want to see. Therefore, it must be over. But I do look at him, and I do think that, here's a guy who we talked about how great he was physically, and he played with a lot of injuries that probably a lot of guys wouldn't have. And so, maybe he didn't heal his body as well as he should have in his younger days. And again, those things catch up to you. We talked about it with quarterbacks earlier. Yes, he's only 31, but Father Time's undefeated. If you beat up your body, 31 can be like 41 if you physically can't do it anymore.
So I'm going to ask you this in the context of sports media, not necessarily inside NFL insiders or people that work for teams in that nature who have inside information about how things work. But in terms of sports media, what role, if any, do you think his clothes and the way he presents himself in public, how he dresses and whatnot, does that have an impact on an assessment of it? That's kind of what I was getting at before.
No, if he came out and he did his post-game press conferences in a suit, just a normal suit and tie, and again, like Eli Manning does. Eli's never been a flashy guy or whatever, but he did that. But we want to put people, this is the thing, I think in general, it's not just sports media, it's all media, but it's all society. We want to put people in whatever box we think they should be in. If you're a quarterback, you should look like this. You should play like this. You should carry yourself like this. Then we get someone outside the norm, and whether it's a Cam Newton or a Baker Mayfield, it's fun for a while. But as soon as they aren't successful anymore, or as successful as they have been, we go right back to it's because they're not buttoned down or doing the things that the other quarterbacks are doing. Whereas we used to celebrate them being able to not be, conformists, but as soon as they stop doing it, exactly. So it becomes the easy out to go back to, well, he dresses like this or he acts like this, therefore he can't be about anything but himself. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think it's unfair to the athletes, to anybody, period, to tell them they've got to be in the box that you want them to be in. And if they're not, then there's something wrong with them. That's really a you problem.
Kurt, I really appreciate the time. Great conversation. I hope we can do this again.
Absolutely. No problem. I got the app downloaded now, so I'm ready.
Awesome. Fancred, baby. Thanks again. Take care. That's Kurt Menefee of Fox NFL Sunday. Does a tremendous job. You can set your watch to Kurt Menefee and the guys at Fox. They set the standard. They really invented the studio show that we have today. With all due respect to Brent Musburger and company over at CBS, I think they took it to the next level. And Kurt, of course, is an integral part of that on your Sundays. He's in our living room. He's with us every Sunday, and we really appreciate him dropping by. Also want to thank our guests from earlier today. As far as the NFL is concerned, Albert Breer joined us from MMQB, Sports Illustrated. Ross Dellinger joined us as well from Sports Illustrated, Barrett Salih from CBS Sports HQ, and Peter Burns of the SEC Network. Got my point across, at least when it comes to college football and the coaching situations. I'm going to continue to talk about it because I got even more information. We'll continue to talk about Antonio Brown, and in the aftermath tomorrow, I'm sure we'll see all eyes are going to be on Jalen Ramsey, not only on the field coming up tonight against the Titans, but in the aftermath. It's a fascinating situation, kind of unprecedented in NFL history, at least from what I can remember. Right in the middle of the season, a guy able to demand a trade and get a trade that fast. It makes you wonder if the NFL is changing in a profound way, much more significant way than we really realize. This could be a turning point. This could be a precedent for a lot more player movement in season. So for our producer, Cam Smith in Boston, and the whole Fancred team, this is Brooks Melchior in Los Angeles saying so long, and this has been Sports by Brooks on Fancred.